Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
At my sister Emily's bridal shower, just as the last round of champagne was being poured and everyone was buzzing on compliments and cucumber sandwiches, my mom stood up in her pale peach blouse that screamed, "I still run this family," raised her glass with theatrical precision, and said, "Here's to the daughter who's finally getting it right." The whole room laughed like it was a sitcom punchline. People clinked their glasses, a few guests did those fake little and Emily giggled with that perfect, sugar-coated smugness that she's had since she was 8 years old. I sat there with a polite smile stretched across my face so tight I thought it might crack in half. I didn't say anything. Not yet. Not until I reached into my purse, walked over without saying a word, and handed my mother a small white envelope. Just one line left my mouth. "You might want to read what your right one has been hiding." The room didn't just go silent, it froze. You could feel it in the air, that sudden shift, like everyone had been jolted awake at the exact same second. No music, no forks tapping plates, just stunned silence and the ticking sound of Diane McCarthy's reputation starting to bleed. You want to know how we got there? Then let me back up. Growing up in our house, there were two very different sets of rules, Rachel's rules and Emily's kingdom. I was born first, the oops baby, according to what my mother once whispered a little too loudly at Thanksgiving after her third mimosa. Emily came along 3 years later, and from the second she could bat her eyelashes, the sun basically rose and set out of her little ballet flats. I wasn't ugly or broken, just not her. I got B+, she got awards. I had 2 part-time jobs in college, she had spring break in Cabo. And my mom, oh my mom, she loved us both, I suppose, but one of us she loved out loud, with framed photos on every mantel, Facebook posts about my brilliant girl, and hugs that lasted just a few seconds longer. The other? Well, that one got tough love and a lot of reminders not to ruin dinner with her attitude. I tried, you know? I really did. I went to college on a partial scholarship, studied graphic design, worked at a local coffee shop while doing freelance gigs just to keep my lights on. Meanwhile, Emily floated through a business major on the wings of my parents' bank account, met Zach at a summer internship, and by the time she turned 26, they were buying a house in the suburbs and planning destination weddings. The same suburbs where I lived in a rental apartment over a hardware store and drank boxed wine on Friday nights with my friend from work. Not that I minded that life, but I minded how it was seen by my family. Like I had somehow chosen failure on purpose. Every holiday, it was the same thing, my mom playing the role of cheerleader for Emily while treating me like the benchwarmer who couldn't quite get her act together. If I brought a boyfriend, he was too quiet or too loud or hadn't settled down yet. If I said I was happy with freelance work, she'd make a little noise with her mouth like she just bit into something sour. Emily got praise for trying Pilates. I got silence for paying my own rent. So by the time we got to that bridal shower, I was already on my last nerve. The decorations were all blush pink and gold accents, Emily's colors, as if she'd invented the palette. Everywhere I looked, there were little signs that read "Love is sweet," and she said yes, and I couldn't help but think, sure, but to what exactly? Because behind Emily's shiny veneer and Zach's cologne commercial smile, I always sensed something off. And maybe it was years of being the outsider, but I trusted my instincts more than I trusted anyone's good vibes. The shower itself was full of women from Emily's Pilates class, sorority sisters, a few cousins, and the usual obligatory family, me included. I showed up in a navy dress I found on clearance, brought a gift card to Crate and Barrel, and sat at a table with 2 aunts who hadn't spoken to me in 5 years. It was one of those days where you already know how it's going to go before you even ring the bell. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Conversations that started and stopped around you like you weren't even there. A few people asked me about work, but only in that polite, shallow way, like they were checking a box before asking where Emily was registered. Then came the toast. Of course it was my mom who initiated it. She always found a spotlight, whether it was hers to take or not. She stood, gently tapped her glass with the edge of a butter knife, and waited for the kind of silence she used to command with just a look. Then, with that tight little smirk she wore like perfume, she said, "Here's to the daughter who's finally getting it right." I looked up, dead in the eyes, and watched her drain her champagne like it was some kind of holy water. The table around me laughed. Not in a malicious way, no, but that soft, knowing chuckle that says we all agree, even if no one says it outright. I didn't clap. I didn't smile. I just sat there, letting the blood pound in my ears, and remembered every single time I got it wrong. Like the time I told her I was moving in with my boyfriend and she said, "Oh honey, you always fall for the losers." Or the time I asked for help with a loan after I lost my job during the pandemic and she said, "You made your bed, Rachel." Or the time I got promoted to lead designer at my agency and she responded with, "Is that full-time now or still freelance?" I knew right then, after that toast, that I wasn't just the older sister anymore. I was the punchline. But I hadn't come unprepared. I debated for days whether or not to bring the envelope. Whether to give it to Emily in private, or Zach, or maybe just let it burn in the back of a drawer and watch the whole thing implode naturally over time. But something told me, some deep gut-level voice, that it had to be now. It had to be here. Because this was the theater. This was where the performance happened. And if I was going to light the match, I wanted it to be center stage. So I reached into my purse, pulled out a thin white envelope, nothing dramatic, just enough, and walked straight toward my mother. She was laughing at something someone said, holding her second glass of champagne, and I watched the expression fall off her face as I got closer. I handed her the envelope. No flourish. Just one sentence, soft and calm. "You might want to read what your right one has been hiding." And then I turned around and went back to my seat. No one laughed this time. For a moment, it felt like even the air had forgotten how to move, like the entire room collectively inhaled and then froze mid-breath, waiting for Diane's reaction as she stared down at the plain white envelope now resting in her manicured hands. Her expression morphing from confusion to discomfort with every slow second that passed, while the women seated closest to her leaned in just slightly, their curiosity unspoken but unmistakably present, the kind of voyeuristic anticipation that simmers under the surface in families like ours, where appearances matter more than reality and no one ever says what they really mean unless it's behind someone's back. My mother didn't open it right away, of course. She stared at it like it might explode or crawl across the table and shatter her carefully curated illusion of control, but I knew her better than anyone in that room. Knew that the moment she thought she was being challenged in public, especially by me, she would have no choice but to prove she wasn't afraid, that she still held all the power, that no matter what I had handed her, she would win. So she slit the envelope with her nail, one slow swipe, and unfolded the 2-page document with all the drama of someone unsealing state secrets. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I just watched her face. At first, her eyes flicked across the paper like she was skimming for a punchline, like whatever this was would be easily dismissed, something beneath her. But then I saw the shift. Her pupils stopped moving. Her lips parted slightly, and for just a heartbeat, I saw something I had never once seen on my mother's face in 38 years, uncertainty. Maybe even fear. She folded the pages in half, then again, and looked up at me like I had just dug up a body in the middle of her garden party. "You did this?" she asked, her voice low, almost hissing, like she was trying to keep it from carrying too far. "No," I said calmly, leaning slightly toward her, letting the tension settle like dust. "Zach did. I just made sure you couldn't pretend not to know." I didn't wait for her reply. I stood and walked to the drink table, poured myself a full glass of champagne, and pretended not to notice the whispers beginning to swirl around the room. Women glanced at each other with that unmistakable gleam in their eyes, the one that always appears when something polite and well-dressed starts to unravel in front of them. You could practically feel the shift in the atmosphere, like someone had opened a door and let all the secrets crawl in. Let me take you back 2 months. I was eating a turkey sandwich at my desk, half watching a YouTube video about unethical marketing psychology and half answering client emails, when I got a text from Angela. Angela and I go back to our freshman dorm at college, where we bonded over a mutual hatred of group projects and a shared addiction to microwaved quesadillas. These days, we're not close, but we text, we keep tabs, we share memes. That day, her message was short and weird enough to make me reread it twice. Hey, is your sister's fiancé tall? Like 6 feet? Brown hair, kinda Wall Street hot. I blinked. Wall Street hot was a very specific description. Yeah, why? I replied, waiting only a second before she answered. I swear I just saw him at the Intercontinental downtown. With a girl. Not your sister. And they looked close. She followed it up with a grainy photo taken from her table across the bar. It was Zach, no doubt. His hand was on the small of a blonde woman's back, and they were both laughing, heads leaned in close like they were sharing a private joke. It was blurry, yes, but unmistakable in its intimacy. I stared at that photo for a long time, longer than I probably should have, because part of me didn't want to believe it, not because I liked Zach, God, I didn't, but because I knew exactly what it would mean to confront it. I tried to talk myself out of caring. For 2 full days, I let the picture sit in my phone gallery, untouched, hoping I'd forget it or maybe convince myself I was jumping to conclusions. But on day 3, I cracked. I reached out to a guy I'd met through a freelance gig last year, a low-key PI who had done some surveillance for a client trying to protect her art assets during a divorce. He wasn't slick or expensive or particularly charming, but he got results and he owed me a favor. Follow him for 2 weeks, I said, giving him Zach's work address, his social media, anything I could scrape together. I just want to know if there's something real going on. What came back was more than I expected. The PI, Tommy, sent me a file with photos, receipts, timestamps, even parking garage entries. Zach had a second apartment. Not a sketchy motel room or a friend's couch, a fully furnished, modern apartment in a building that offered concierge service and complimentary wine nights. And more than that, he wasn't just seeing someone, he was with someone. A woman named Claire, who worked in interior design and was, according to Tommy, pregnant. 5 months. 5 months. The math was simple and damning. Emily and Zach had been engaged for 7. He wasn't cheating once or twice, he was running 2 full relationships in tandem. And if Emily knew, if she suspected even an ounce of this, she wasn't showing it. At first, I told myself to leave it alone. It wasn't my circus, not my monkeys. I had spent years being shut out, brushed off, treated like I was just bitter because Emily was doing better, as if every milestone she hit was another reminder that I had fallen short. Maybe letting her figure it out on her own was just as enough. But then I remembered Christmas last year. How my mom went out of her way to tell everyone at the dinner table that Emily always had better judgment in men. How she said it while looking directly at me, sipping her wine, letting the silence confirm what she meant. So I printed everything. I made copies. I wrote a 2-page summary explaining the timeline. I didn't editorialize. I didn't vent. I didn't twist the knife. I just laid it out, clear as glass. And then I waited. When the shower invitation arrived, I knew. That envelope wasn't revenge. It was the truth delivered cold, in public, the way they'd always made me swallow their little barbs and judgments. Except this time, I brought receipts. Back at the party, my mother's hands were shaking slightly as she refolded the letter and tucked it into her purse like it might disappear if she just ignored it hard enough. I took a long sip of my champagne, still standing by the drink table, and waited for the sound, the murmur, the break, the whisper that always comes before the storm. But it didn't come from the guests. It came from Emily. She had crossed the room and picked up the envelope from my mother's bag without a word, her fingers trembling just enough to betray her calm. She read it. Every page. Her face didn't move, didn't twitch, didn't fall, not until the final paragraph. Then she looked up, straight at Zach, and said one word, barely a whisper, but loud enough to send a ripple through the entire room. Is this true? Zach didn't answer. Not yet. There's a specific kind of silence that follows a direct accusation in a room full of people who are all pretending to be happy for someone. It's not like the hush that comes with grief, and it's not like the pause that follows bad news. No, it's heavier, thicker. A slow-moving fog that settles into the corners of a room when everyone suddenly remembers they don't actually know each other that well, and they might not like what's about to come out of someone's mouth. That's what filled the bridal shower when Emily, still clutching the pages she had just read, turned toward Zach and asked if it was true. Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She didn't even raise her tone. It was flat, emotionless, terrifyingly neutral. The voice of a woman who has been holding her breath for months and finally exhales, not because she's ready, but because she has no other choice. Zach, to his credit, or maybe to his consistent pattern of practiced deceit, didn't flinch at first. His face, smooth and unreadable, held the expression of someone calculating in real time, like he was building a new story before the old one had even fully collapsed. His hands stayed in his pockets, his weight balanced evenly, and for a moment, I thought he might actually try to deny it. But then he glanced around the room, saw the way every single person had turned to him, waiting, some with pity in their eyes, some with morbid curiosity, and a few with open judgment, and in that split second, you could see the panic bloom behind his carefully managed calm. "Babe," he said, the word already an insult to the moment, already a crack in his armor. "I don't know what this is, but I think we both know your sister has always had a problem with me. Maybe this is her way of—" Emily didn't let him finish. She held up the second page, the one with the time-stamped photos, the ones my PI had taken of Zach unlocking the door to an apartment in a neighborhood far out of their supposed budget, walking arm in arm with a tall blonde woman whose hand rested comfortably on his stomach, as if it belonged there. Emily's voice cut through his attempt at spin like a scalpel. "Claire. That's her name, isn't it? You told her you were going to end things with me months ago." The way Zach's eyes widened, it wasn't fear. Not exactly, it was the look of a man realizing he'd finally run out of ways to wriggle out of the net, and for a guy like Zach, who had made a lifestyle out of charm and deflection, that realization was devastating. He opened his mouth again, probably to deny, to redirect, to gaslight and manipulate his way back into her trust, but Emily dropped the pages onto the floor like they were used napkins and turned her back to him. A gesture so simple and deliberate it was more powerful than if she'd screamed. The room shifted again. The guests started whispering, half shielding their mouths like it made a difference, while a few women excused themselves to the patio, likely texting mutual friends with a play-by-play. Someone turned off the background music. My mother sat frozen in her seat, one hand gripping the stem of her champagne glass so tightly I thought it might snap, her jaw set like she was deciding whether to feign ignorance or implode publicly. Meanwhile, I stood by the drink table, utterly still, watching it all unravel, watching the Golden Daughter's perfect day fall apart like tissue paper in the rain. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something electric behind my ribs. It wasn't joy, exactly, not in the schadenfreude sense, but it was satisfaction, a deeply rooted, long-suppressed exhale of years spent eating my words, biting my tongue, nodding while being patronized and pitted. Smiling through the erosion of every dignified boundary, I had to maintain peace at the table. I didn't blow the whistle for revenge. I blew it because, for once, I wanted the truth to be louder than the lie. But the thing is, truth doesn't land cleanly in families like mine. It's not a way-up call or a clear path to healing. It's more like a wrecking ball that hits the wrong wall first, knocking everything out of order before anyone can make sense of what to fix. Because even as Zach stood there, visibly unraveling, and Emily excused herself to the bathroom with one of her bridesmaids trailing behind her like a shadow, my mother stood up from her seat and made her way toward me, not frantic, not hysterical, but calm. Too calm, the kind of calm that people mistake for control, but is actually made of pure, boiling rage that hasn't found a direction yet. She didn't yell. Diane never yelled. That would be beneath her. She simply stepped in close, her perfume a suffocating cloud of lavender and expensive denial, and said in a tone sharp enough to cut bone, "You've ruined your sister's life. You couldn't just let her have this, could you?" I stared at her, utterly stunned, not because I didn't expect her to blame me, but because she had the gall to do it so brazenly in the aftermath of everything. I took a slow breath and replied, "I didn't ruin anything. I just didn't let her walk into a lie with her eyes closed. She scoffed, an elegant sound if you didn't know her like I did. She was happy. Do you have any idea how hard it is to find happiness? You're bitter, Rachel. You always have been. And now you've taken that bitterness and poured it all over her future like poison. I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because it was so achingly, tragically predictable. No, Mom, I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. I didn't pour anything. Zach did. I just pointed out the puddle before she drowned in it. She opened her mouth again, probably to deliver another line about how Emily was her hope, her pride, her success story, and how I was still the one they couldn't quite explain to their friends. But before she could speak, a bridesmaid returned to the room and announced that Emily had locked herself in the bathroom and wasn't answering anyone. Zach was gone. I don't know when he left. Maybe he slipped out through the patio while everyone was too focused on the drama. Maybe he knew deep down that there was nothing left to salvage. And maybe, just maybe, he thought if he vanished quickly enough, the damage would scatter in too many directions for anyone to trace it back to him. But I was still there. Still standing. Still waiting. Because I hadn't given Emily the second envelope yet. Not yet. The bathroom door remained closed for what felt like forever, and while the bridesmaids hovered outside whispering soft encouragements and offering entirely useless suggestions, most of the guests had begun quietly collecting their things, slipping their heels back on, dabbing at their lip gloss, muttering about how this isn't really their business, while casting sideways glances that betrayed how desperate they were to know every detail of what had just gone down. The shower had, for all intents and purposes, officially died. The decorations looked oddly pitiful now, rose gold banners drooping at the corners, half-melted macarons sweating in the late afternoon light, and a playlist still faintly humming some overly chirpy love song that felt almost grotesque given the circumstances. I stayed where I was, standing by the table where I had set my glass of untouched champagne, the second envelope burning a hole in my purse like a slow fuse inching toward detonation, and I waited, not out of obligation, not even really out of strategy anymore, but because something in me knew the moment wasn't over yet. And sure enough, about 15 minutes later, the door creaked open and Emily stepped out, not crying, not disheveled, not even visibly shaken in the way everyone had expected, but quiet, composed, and eerily distant. The look of someone who had passed through a storm and arrived somewhere she didn't recognize. She didn't speak to her bridesmaids. She didn't look at Zach, who still hadn't returned. She didn't acknowledge our mother, who was now pacing the edge of the room like a queen without a court, her composure thinning with every second. Emily just walked straight to me, her heels clicking against the tile in deliberate, sharp rhythm, and stopped barely 2 feet away from where I stood. Her face was unreadable, which made it all the more unnerving. "I want to know why you waited," she said, and the question hit with more weight than I expected, not because it was unfair, but because it was honest, stripped of drama, and posed by someone who wasn't playing the golden child anymore, but rather a woman genuinely asking her sister what the hell had motivated her to blow her world apart in front of 36 witnesses. I took a breath, not because I needed to compose myself, but because this very moment, was the one I hadn't fully prepared for. I had imagined rage, denial, tears, even a physical slap, but not this cold, quiet interrogation of motive. I waited. I began slowly, carefully, my voice steady but not rehearsed, because I wasn't sure if you already knew. And I didn't want to destroy your illusion if you were choosing it on purpose. I watched her eyes narrow slightly, not in anger but in concentration, like she was measuring each word. And when Mom made that toast, to the daughter who's finally getting it right, I realized that I wasn't just protecting you anymore. I was letting her weaponize your ignorance against me. Again. Emily's jaw tensed, a small movement, but enough to tell me something was shifting behind the silence. "So this was about Mom," she said, not as an accusation but as a deduction, the way someone identifies a familiar ache in a place they haven't felt pain in a while. "No," I replied quickly, but truthfully it was about the truth. But yes, her toast was the match. Not because I wanted to ruin your day, but because I couldn't sit there and let her pretend that my silence meant she was right about everything she's ever said to me. Emily looked down then, not in defeat, but as if she was trying to piece together two different puzzles. The one where she was the center of everyone's love, and the one where maybe she was just as complicit in someone else's pain. I reached into my bag and pulled out the second envelope, this one smaller, more personal, handwritten, no photos, no evidence, just context. This, I said, holding it out to her, is for when you're ready. It's not proof. It's what you didn't see. What you didn't ask about. What Mom never told you because it was easier to make me the problem. She didn't take it right away. She looked at it the way you'd look at a diary someone offered to let you read, not sure if you really wanted to know what was inside, but suspecting that if you did, you wouldn't be able to pretend anymore. Finally, she took it, slid it into her purse without reading the front, and nodded once, more to herself than to me. You know, she said, her voice lower now, almost conversational. I did know. Not everything. Not the baby. But I knew there was someone. I saw a message on his laptop months ago, something about meeting again, and when I asked, he told me it was a work contact, that I was overreacting. She paused, as if daring herself to keep going. And I believed him. Or rather, I decided I didn't want to find out I was right. Because that would mean everything we were building wasn't real. And that I'd have to start over. It hit me then, how deep the conditioning ran. Not just in me, but in her too. How we had both been shaped by the same woman, just in opposite ways. I was made to doubt myself, and she was made to doubt the world around her, to believe that the appearance of happiness was worth more than the pursuit of truth. I didn't do this to humiliate you, I said softly. I did it so you wouldn't marry someone who was building a lie right under your feet. Because I know what it feels like to wake up years later and realize you're in a life someone else chose for you. She nodded again, and for a flicker of a second, I saw something in her face that looked like regret, not for the wedding, or the man, or even the party, but maybe for all the times she had sat beside our mother and let me be the outsider, the difficult one, the daughter who couldn't quite get it together. My mother approached then, like a storm returning for its final lap, her expression a careful mask of restraint over what I could only imagine was volcanic fury. She looked at Emily, then at me, then back again, clearly trying to find a foothold in the shifting dynamic that was no longer under her control. I think we've had enough drama for one day, she said, her voice tight and brittle. Emily didn't respond. She turned toward the door, her posture tall but tired, her movements deliberate. But just before she walked out, she looked back at me and said, "You were the sister I never really had. Until today." Then she was gone. And I was left standing in the echo of a family that had been unraveling for years, one careful lie at a time. By the time the front doors finally closed behind the last of the guests, some leaving in awkward silence, others offering mumbled excuses, one or two pausing long enough to cast a final glance back like they might miss another twist, the room felt eerily hollow. Stripped of the manicured joy it had been so carefully dressed in just hours earlier, now reduced to half-empty glasses sweating onto cocktail napkins and rose petals crushed beneath scuffed heels, the scent of expensive perfume clinging stubbornly to the air like a ghost refusing to acknowledge it had outstayed its welcome. The once celebratory atmosphere, curated down to the shade of pink frosting on the cupcakes, had collapsed into a sort of stunned quiet, the kind that doesn't invite conversation so much as repel it. The kind that only remains when something irreversible has been said out loud and can no longer be retracted, even if no one's quite ready to admit what it means. I stood near the windows, staring out at the suburban cul-de-sac where the balloons tied to the mailbox swayed gently in the warm wind, cheerful and oblivious to the implosion that had just taken place inside. The silence wasn't peaceful. It wasn't reflective or healing or any of those storybook moments people fantasize about when they picture confrontation as a catharsis. It was heavy, tense, and laced with questions none of us were ready to ask out loud. The kind of silence that holds its breath just long enough to convince you it might not exhale at all. My mother hadn't spoken since Emily left. She hovered near the kitchen island, still clinging to her glass of champagne like it might save her from drowning in the truth she'd been forced to swallow, her expression calcified into something between shame and disdain, though I couldn't tell which emotion she was directing toward me. I half expected another lecture, another attempt to rewrite the story so that I was the cruel one, the bitter sister who couldn't stand to see anyone else happy, but the words never came, and maybe that was worse than any accusation, maybe silence. From a woman who had never known how to shut her mouth when it came to my life, was the loudest admission of guilt I would ever get. I thought about leaving then, quietly, without fanfare, just slipping my purse over my shoulder and walking out the door like someone who had finally finished playing a game she never wanted to be part of in the first place. But something in me hesitated, not out of regret, and not because I needed some final word from the woman who had spent most of my life convincing me I wasn't enough, but because I needed a moment to feel the weight of what had just happened, and what hadn't. It was then, as I stood in that awkward in-between space where consequences start to settle and everyone starts bracing for whatever comes next, that Emily returned, not with Zach, not in tears, not wearing the collapse of her engagement on her face like a scar, but alone, calm, and strangely composed, as though the storm had passed through her and left behind something clearer, colder, more grounded than whatever she'd been before. She didn't look at our mother. She walked past her without acknowledgement, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood, and stopped just a few feet in front of me. Her eyes were different, not glazed with confusion or disbelief anymore, but sharp and focused, like someone who had decided that denial wasn't a luxury she could afford for another minute. She reached into her bag and pulled out the second envelope, the one I'd given her before she left, and held it out to me, unopened. "I'm not ready for this," she said, her voice firm but not hostile. "But I will be. Just not today." I nodded, taking it from her without a word, folding it back into my purse with the same deliberate care I had used to prepare it. I hadn't expected her to read it today, and, honestly, I hadn't expected her to come back at all. But the fact that she did alone, clear-eyed, and without the performance, meant more than any apology she could have offered. She exhaled slowly, glanced around the wreckage of her bridal shower, the toppled gifts, the lipstick-stained glasses, the abandoned party favors like plastic reminders of a celebration that had turned into something entirely different, and then, almost as an afterthought, said something that caught me completely off guard. "You know," she began, her tone distant but purposeful, "for most of our lives, I thought you were angry because you weren't me. But I think maybe you were angry because I never tried to be anything but what Mom needed me to be." I didn't respond, not because I didn't have a response, but because anything I said in that moment would have reduced the weight of what she'd just said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a request for forgiveness. It was a rare moment of clarity, the kind that only comes after everything has broken open and there's nothing left to protect. She left again, this time with less drama, no slammed doors or desperate glances, just a quiet exit that somehow felt more permanent than anything else that had happened that day. After she was gone, I sat down at the table where the cupcakes were still arranged in their perfectly symmetrical tiers, now untouched and absurdly cheerful, and let my mind wander, not to the future. Not to what Thanksgiving would look like this year or how my mother would attempt to rewrite this chapter when she eventually told her version of it to her friends, but to the strange, bitter irony of it all. That for decades, I had been told I was the one who couldn't get it right, the one who didn't follow the path, who didn't settle down with the right kind of man, who didn't build a life worth celebrating in a Pinterest-worthy brunch with peonies and Prosecco. And yet here we were. The daughter who always got it right had almost married a liar. The daughter who always got it wrong had stopped her. And still, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated or triumphant or like I'd finally won some long-overdue battle. I just felt tired. Because truth, real truth, isn't a trophy. It's heavy. It's complicated. It forces people to see things they'd rather keep hidden, and it doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes it just brings change. Sometimes it brings nothing at all. I don't know what Emily will do with what I gave her, whether she'll read it in a week, or a month, or never. I don't know if my mother will ever say the words I've waited my entire adult life to hear. I doubt it. People like her don't apologize, they reframe. But what I do know, as I finally gathered my things and stepped out into the golden hour light of early evening, is that silence has a way of stretching out and strangling you when you let it grow too long. And on that day, I ended mine. I didn't do it for revenge. Not really. I did it because pretending everything is fine is a disease, and our family had been terminal for years. Still, I can't lie to you and say I'm sure I did the right thing. I just did the only thing that felt honest. And maybe that's what getting it right really means. What about you? If it were your sister, your family, your mother standing there with that smile that's only ever pointed in one direction, would you have handed over the envelope? Or would you have walked away and let her figure it out the hard way? Because between you and me, I still don't know if I saved her. Or if I just set the whole damn thing on fire.